The other day, I travelled into Dublin city from the endless sprawl of suburbia to see the new Francis Ford Coppola movie, Megalopolis. I wanted to see it in one of the more plush cinemas in Dublin city centre to enjoy the magic of the silver screen. Travelling into Dublin city feels like piercing some invisible membrane and entering a strange psychic miasma which hangs over the entirety of Dublin city, north, south, east and west. It begins to occur as you move away from the coast, as you pass Booterstown. The coast curves all the way around to Howth. This train heads inland to ever greater density. And you find yourself in a city that now feels like any city in Europe, or God forbid, London. Years ago, it was something of an exotic treat to travel all the way to London to see a concert or a festival or go to a museum, to walk along the Thames. And you always marvelled in the back of your mind how anybody could live like this as an anonymous individual in the multitudes of millions, a sea of strangers' faces, all avoiding eye contact. The home of a global population brought together by high finance. In those days, the only English people you would meet would be the taxi drivers in the city centre, while the English population had long moved out to suburbia and the countryside. But in those days, pre-Sniffles, you would still often have the entertainment of meeting an actual indigenous English person who would rant with some enthusiasm about the war crimes of Tony Blair. And we'd return home having seen some concert or film or festival, often carrying back a record and a book or a graphic novel that was hard to find. And we would return to this place, the same urban and suburban place, that still held quite a different culture and slower pace of life. But what we see in Dublin now is that it is all ancient history. We have had our internal clocks synchronized to the global beat, the endless 24/7 stream of commerce and information. It's sort of amusing to think of those Anglo-Saxons who go on holiday to the Mediterranean, to Greece and Spain and Portugal, and discover a pace of life more akin to how humans lived 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Yes, it's true, if you really needed that plumber or electrician or needed a new phone installed on a landline, you would find yourself waiting a long time. That was the trade-off, a slower pace of life for a higher quality of life. But we see now Dublin city is entangled with all global streams, a place of the progressive cult. The train passes through Tara Street with its absurd mural dedicated to an androgynous transhuman future. A city with pride emblazoned on its trains and buses. So you are sure to know that you are in a place of globalist occupation. As soon as I walked into Connell Street station, the first thing I saw was a tall, thin man wearing a dress, waiting for some connection, with $26 in his hand. And we looked down the quays, the river running from the custom house to the forecourts, with all our shiny new steel and glass, myriad shining bridges. We find this shining place of homogeneous creation, with only the tallest steeples of archaic churches and cathedrals reminding you where you might be. Yes, the very city home to all those saints and scholars. You too can visit the very Starbucks that Jonathan Swift used. Go to the McDonald's that was Brendan Behan's local. For in this world all is the same, and being made the same at a ferocious rate of euros being printed into infinity. The city means being in a place, in a high density concentration of psychic occultdom, an artificial safe space for the progressive cult eating its own tail. To visit this place means having a taxi driver from Africa, a hotel receptionist from Eastern Europe, maybe an Australian as your waitress. And where do you go to meet these famous Irish people? And what is on your itinerary? A visit to Tesco's, McDonald's, Starbucks, Marks and Spencer's. So you can tick that box off, that you visited that small European city of Dublin town. And the public transport teems with the excess population of Africa, India and Asia, all drawn to the money printers without any consideration for the history books or the process of awakening that the indigenous population is going through. And when we find ourselves sitting in that plush cinema and the lights darken to bring us home into the womb of that artificial cave where we may perchance to dream something different, our first experience is a bombardment of propaganda, the recruitment of youth into climate cults with all appropriately meaningless buzzwords such as sustainability. And you would imagine that any person who still has two brain cells to rub together after recent years and various experimental medical procedures, that they might look at what is being presented to them as utterly psychotic and absurd. When the individual finds themselves watching the world pass by from the bank of the river. One is left to contemplate, are they watching a comedy or tragedy? And the movement of all subtle energies through this physical world. After watching the adverts sponsored by the EU to recruit you into the Hitler Youth, we then have an advert informing us of how important it is for adults to consent to their activities in the bedroom. And I could not feel a greater sense of revulsion in the core of my gut at this grotesque invasion by the state into the personal lives of its citizens. We see all mass media now, wherever you may live. In Ireland we have RTE, in Britain the BBC, in America you have choice of CNN or Fox News, but all propaganda, all social and cultural engineering. We see the creation of this statism all around us. A statism that can be interpreted as a kind of far left, authoritarian fascism. And of course, fascism is this term of abuse that anybody on the left, the far left, and the progressives like to throw at anybody who may object to such things as pedophilia. The fascism we see all around us is corporate fascism. And corporate fascism is the merging of corporate power with the state. So the state can pass on its diktats to corporations and then proclaim that it has nothing to do with you from entering a supermarket. If the corporation decrees that its customers require facial recognition and such, we see ourselves placed on a crossroads of the public-private partnership, the creation of an authoritarian top-down system that instructs you how to live. But more than that, it seeks psychic war, a war on consciousness, a war of good and evil, a spiritual war raging invisibly all around you, which manifests into this 3D world. When people ask to look at your phone, and the madness of crowds are lost in a synthetic euphoria as they clutch their rainbow swastikas to their breast. And all questions are answered. If you ever wondered what you and the people you know would do if they had found themselves as citizens of Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, and now we know. Because we know we live in an age of madness, where everything appears so normal on the surface due to the soft soma of consumerism. And as long as the bread and circuses continue to be rolled out, there's little reason for the average person to change their behavior. The average person just needs to accept the latest system update until they are fully atomized, separated and isolated within the metaverse. We live in an age where people think they can save the world by taxing the weather. The age of total absurdity. And we know the only way through this is a future that is local, not global. And Dublin City is a place that still has its working class communities somewhat intact in the face of the globalist monolith. But the experience on the street is one of total alienation, of no common ground or social cues, as alien cultures are shoved together beneath the Tower of Babel. And we see that high trust society like a pen full of sheep and wolves, for we have nothing in common with one another but that we are consumers of globalist systems. So we can't sit in the silver screen in that synthetic cave without first being properly instructed and indoctrinated into the cult. And finally, we have the vision of Francis Ford Coppola's new epic, Megalopolis. A film that can be understood as being made by someone who knows the history of cinema and all its techniques. Essentially, an art house film made in an operatic aesthetic. A film reaching for the highest archetypes to explore the power structures around us, those competing forces in manipulation of the masses. And what we find greeting it from the youth in the audience is laughter. Laughter at things they find incomprehensible. Laughter that comes from a place of arrogant ignorance. It seems in the past that it was the duty of the initiate, the learner, for them to reach up towards greater knowledge, to inform themselves of things they hadn't heard of before, to understand references. It required a process of educating yourself. But what we have now in our idiocracy is a total dumbing down, where many young people expect everything to be remade for them in easily digestible chunks of information. They expect a conformity of opinion and fact. Everything must be ideologically tested, lest one feel the displeasure of an invisible microaggression touching their soul from the silver screen. This is the culture of the lowest common denominator, the perfect idiots of the New World Order, all dressed identically as though in some 1980s a cosplay convention. Baseball caps, synthetic puffy jackets, and moustaches from porn films. Clown children. Watching the film, there really was nothing so strange or absurd to make one laugh. if one understood that the artist was making aesthetic choices to place their characters in high archetypal opera, it makes no sense to criticize an action film for not being funny enough, or to criticize a comedy for not having enough car chases. But Coppola does in his old age what is the ultimate anathema to the millennials and Generation Z. He offers his creativity in earnest exploration of the predicament the human individual finds themselves in as they pass through this age of madness in the hope of surviving with their humanity and soul intact. And before watching the film, I had heard it suggested that perhaps Coppola was another person suffering from Trump derangement syndrome, with some of the comments he'd made in interviews. But what the actual film delivered itself was something completely fascinating. He dares to do the unthinkable, but look at the metaphysics of the human soul without irony. He looks at the way we live and what we're transitioning through to the new age of Aquarius without laughter, but with some absurdity intact. The young person's greatest fear is to be too earnest, to care too much, to have their own thoughts and beliefs and values. They're lost in the endless projection of the surface. Narcissus never seeing beyond the reflection of himself, and thus mistaking reality for being 1 millimeter thick. Coppola included a couple of scenes in this film that I had heard nobody reference, and was quite honestly shocked. The first being the controlled demolition of a building in New York. A moment frozen in time with the conceit of science fiction. And yes, Coppola actually goes to that place, the controlled demolition that began this new age. He gives us another scene where characters seek the true birth certificate of a singer so that they may know her real name and age. And one can only be amazed Coppola would put such a scene in his Hollywood vision. But his vision is one that's privately funded. Coppola, like George Lucas, came out of film school wanting to make experimental art house films, and then somehow accidentally found himself with wealth, fame and power to usher in a new age of blockbusters. And people often wondered, with all their wealth, why Coppola and George Lucas didn't return to their experimental roots and make those offbeat films. Well, here Coppola gives his final statement, perhaps from the vantage point of being in his 80s. Can he now be accused of anything worse in the age of ideological purity than of being a boomer offering an earnest vision of a better world? We find ourselves in this convergence point of midwits attempting to unconsciously carry us all into the great the sacrifice of the singularity, the outsourcing of the higher functions of our mind and soul to technology, run by the most corrupt and evil people. The people who we find whose parents and grandparents were eugenicists. And now the midwits ruin everything, run amok, unleashed upon us, entering into areas they have no place, spreading like a psychic virus through the landscape. We see their opinions, thoughts, objections, misunderstandings being brought into every aspect of life. We see them moving into film, into music, art, literature. The spaces that were for artists and intellectuals are now filled with the concerns of midwits seeking conformity of opinion so that their post may be upvoted on Reddit. With the birth of discussion forums on the internet in the 1990s and 2000s, you saw all those people who had a specialist interest or niche finding one another, other people with enthusiasm for their hobbies, their arts and crafts, a place to discuss music and film and art. But we see, particularly with music, how much space the midwits take up in their Pavlovian responses to the latest instruction, the artificial sentimentality and nostalgia for a Beatles reunion single, for the next pit stop by Taylor Swift and Coldplay in your globalist city. For you are sure to know that you are a citizen of globalism when you are granted the appearance of celebrities deigning to visit your town. The generation gap from Francis Ford Coppola to Generation Z is a long psychic space, but there's still a generation gap from Generation X and the oldest millennials to the youth and children now who seem to have been processed into the hive mind. A generation where it is celebrated to be a moron and a bootlicker, with all the North Korean style propaganda plastered everywhere in Dubabylon. One wonders, what do gay, lesbian and transgender people have in common? And the simplest answer to that is they're people who don't have children. And what is promoted as the most important issue by globalism but the sexualization of children and the free availability of abortion and euthanasia? It is no secret that the 0.1% do not wish to share anything, with most of the planet entirely empty and all life transposed to that of a sardine living in a tin can. The future proposed is that of a brave new world with Soylent Green, Logan's Run, and presumably the eventuality of a radioactive Planet of the Apes. We see the sea of strangers' faces all around us, and we think, if we are in a climate crisis, why would we move millions upon millions of people from the developing world into the developed world where they will use more carbon, and consume more resources. If we were interested in saving the world, improving the quality of people's lives, we would trade with them freely and fairly. We would help them build their economies and systems of education and healthcare. But instead, they're transposed and transported with all their alien cultures, beliefs, morals, and customs. And if you find one doesn't share the same taboos with your new neighbours, then you are to be silenced. You have no voice. The only acceptable voice is the endless baaing of the sheep. Coppola offers a playful view of the opposing power structures and whose utopia could be built upon the shining hill. He looks at the long view in full knowledge of the rise and fall of civilizations from Greece and Rome to today. And for me, Dublin city could only be comprehended as a place of Babylon, a place of the psychic miasma, the invisible cloud of information churning out clones of drones who dare not ever even begin the process of individuation and self-actualization. The first groggy eye rub of the awakening of the self to their sovereignty and organic heritage, with the blood mingling with 1,000 generations in the soil of their homeland. They're rapidly becoming inculcated against even having the vocabulary to express ideas of freedom. The question for all of us is, how does the human soul survive this processing of humanity into the future? And that begins with accepting responsibility for every choice made, such as what film to watch, what product to buy from which corporation, or if one may be as eccentric to grow one's own food or talk to a local farmer. For those of us who still hold the capacity to tune into the highest frequency of the Godhead, who desire to be fully human, to be a creative artist rather than an animal fulfilling its lowest desires, you shall always be placed in a mystical conflict with the banality of the society being delivered to you by the mediocre midwits unconsciously working on behalf of the pyramid. We can look at the insanity of this technocratic age and be filled with romantic desires to overthrow the entire machinery of civilization. But what does that mean? The people around us can no longer differentiate their life and consciousness from that machinery, from being engaged in the endless scroll of the smartphone that records their entire life as data for big tech, while the soul seeks to write its experiences, its unique subjective vision of the light passing through the prism of consciousness and recording its life into the Akashic field. We're left to observe the psychic collapse, to find creative paths through the labyrinth of the simulacrum. We seek to tune into the enormous creative power of nature. And we can only look at ourselves in the mirror and ask what we choose to accept. What hill are we willing to die on? What can we do to remain human or be processed into the future? While the midwits can only understand progress as a balm for the soul, an invisible force field protecting itself from a spontaneous and violent catharsis, to realize that the concept of progress is one that seeks to suppress all the trauma inflicted by forcing indigenous people into an alien, globalist, technocratic, surveillance, tyrannical state. All we can do is move from the city to the suburbs before abandoning the suburbs for the countryside, where the psychic miasma dissipates in the first sighting of a sheep, a cow, a pig, a horse, a pony, the flock of crows nesting for the night. A reminder that this is reality. And everything else are the dreams and visions of mad men and women seeking to make the world in their image, as they have never been able to process the trauma of realizing they are but a part of the divine living world. The parasites that be see us as only cattle, not even human. And it is for you to prove in your every action and thought that you are human, that this land belongs to you and your kin. The Dublin I remember is the Dublin of around 2011 to 2019, a place that had an electric buzz passing through the city with all its artists and musicians mingling in possible collaboration and shared dreams of creative possibility. But the Dublin of today is a cultural wasteland, a place of uniformity. Dubabylon, an outpost of global Babylon, that biblical city that brought forth the magic of the moneymakers and sought to place us trapped within its closed system. So it only acts as a way to remind us that we must always break on through all invisible membranes of floating electronic information, to wrestle our consciousness back from the technology, to wrestle our souls back from sleeping conformity and make the wildest dreams of our imagination manifest beyond the planned fate of midwit's machinations. And we go on, awakening in every moment, or feel the pain of the sins we self-inflict upon ourselves. And in this instance, sin is to turn backwards to what one knows is harmful when one has already experienced it. But sometimes we can't help but returning in nostalgia to test the waters, to attempt to return to sleep. But once the frozen sea is shattered in our mind, 1,000 fragments are there for us to reintegrate and rebuild as something indestructible, as we can only go forward with the power and force of our own gravity as an individual passing through the endless rise and fall of mediocre visions projecting their madness upon infinite divine creativity, co-creating creation with us in every moment.